Good afternoon. Welcome to session number 10 on measuring sustainability. My name is Ghassan Abu-Lebdeh with the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. Right from the get-go, I will say I'm an engineer. I'm not quite into economic development, sustainability, and all that, although sustainability is a big part of what we teach now, so we are trying to incorporate sustainability in what we teach in engineering and also in our research. In particular, I was pleased to see the session on measuring sustainability, or the title. Engineers, and I will speak for myself first and maybe other engineers in general, if we cannot measure something, if we cannot quantify it, we sort of implicitly assume maybe it can be ignored. Sustainability clearly is a subject that I think is critical, important, and incorporation of the principles of sustainability in everything we do is essential. So to see that we're moving toward being able to not only measure but quantify is particularly important to us in the engineering profession. So without really in the interest of time, we'll just move to the first speaker, Mr. José Alcorta. I will not say much about the speakers. I'll let it up to them to introduce themselves and introduce the topic and then get going. So without further ado, it's all yours.
Thank you. Do we have the presentation clicker? Yes, on Monday. I've got it in a memory stick if you want it. So while the presentation is loaded, I'll just introduce myself and explain who we are. My name is José Alcorta. I'm a technical program manager responsible for the largest bulk of technical committees at ISO. So basically, we develop technical standards, and this has been going on for a number of years. In fact, last year we celebrated our 70th anniversary. So I work for the International Organization for Standardization. ISO was created in 1947, following the Second World War and the destruction of Europe and many other countries around the world involved in that conflict. So the nations met on the 14th of October 1946 in London to decide how to go about the reconstruction efforts. And one of the thoughts was that industry standards had to be consolidated and made universal. So for that, it was thought that a new organization should be created, and that's how ISO was created. ISO started on the 23rd of February 1947, and it was actually the merge of two other existing institutions. One was the Federation of International Standardization bodies, and the second one was the United Nations Standards Coordination Agency. So from there on, we started developing technical standards, and here's the presentation at last. Thank you very much. So that's the original picture of the founding fathers in 1946 in London. So a few details about ISO. ISO is formed by a federation of standardization bodies, one per country, and we are at the moment 162 countries. The Central Secretariat is here in Geneva, and we serve all those nations providing services and support, particularly with an important focus on developing countries and capacity building and technical exchanges. We publish a collection of over 22,000 standards, an average of 1,300 a year, although last year was very profitable in terms of, very productive rather, in terms of standards, and we published 1,578. And we also work not in isolation with our members, but also with other international organizations. And at the moment, we are in liaison with over 700. We have technical committees in all subjects, over 240 active, and they are divided in working groups and subcommittees, which is about 3,500 technical bodies, with a database of over 100,000 experts around the world in different technical fields. And we have per year around close to 5,000 projects open for standards. So with that information in mind, you can see the map here of what we cover as areas in the world. And you talk about what is a standard. Well, a standard is a technical document that is developed by consensus by leading technical experts around the world. And it's a double consensus process, because we have consensus at national level, and then that consensus and position is taken into ISO and then is built in consensus around all the other countries. It's a multi-stakeholder platform. We follow the WTO principles, and we added on one ourselves, which is global and market relevance. If it's not relevant to the world, it can be regional or it can be local, but we just don't produce things for the sake of producing standards. They're instruments to facilitating trade, so our aim is to prevent barriers to trade. And they provide benefits for not only companies, organizations, but also to individuals and the society in general. And we like to think that we contribute to sustainable development. So, and again, the picture that you're all very familiar with. And our standards are basically divided into three different areas, which are the pillars of sustainable development, societal, environmental, and economic growth. So from there, we can see synergies in the different standards, and then we are in the process of mapping all the standards to the different SDGs, and we will launch a website also to communicate that information to the ISO members and the public at large, so that they can see how the different standards contribute to the different development goals. I talked about technical groups, and I would like to give a couple of examples. For instance, there's a technical committee that deals with sustainable communities, and they have published a number of standards like the ones that you can see here on sustainable development of communities as a management system for organizations, also strategies for smart cities and communities, indicators for city services and quality of life, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And we also have intelligent transport standards, and now we have just recently created also a technical committee to deal with aging societies as another important topic affecting communities and aging communities in particular. Climate change, we have been doing this since the 80s, and we have ISO 14001, which is the famous tool for environmental management system that allows organizations to manage their aspects, environmental aspects, which is the way they contaminate or reduce pollution. We also have other examples of a more social work with guidelines for good practices for combating land degradation and desertification. There's the mitigation standards on greenhouse gases. We started recently, a couple of years ago, working more closely with the UNFCCC to develop standards and frameworks for principles, methodologies on climate actions, following the different COP meetings, adaptation to climate change, and ultimately vulnerability that is also affecting large communities. So the standard I mentioned on city indicators is a standard that provides a set of indicators, as it says, to steer the delivery of city services and quality of life. So those are the two strands that the standard tries to cover, and for that it produces a number of measures. It's a unique and uniform approach to measurement performance, and is comparable, verifiable, and irrespective of the size of the community, city, and the location around the world. So back to the topic of today, measuring sustainability. So I started from the big, the country needs, then the technical committee needs, and then the specific standards. So what I can say in honesty is that there is no ISO standard for sustainability measurement. We don't have a unified approach. What we do have is that standards may contain requirements which are verifiable. We have key performance indicators in most of the standards that there are different types, and we have methodologies and methods and guidelines on the application. then we leave to certification bodies and auditors, etc., to do the other work. But we are concerned with creating the content that will provide then that ecosystem. So we consider sustainability as the key guiding principle, and for that we developed a few years ago ISO Guide 82, which is a free guide for standard developers. It's not only used by ISO technical committees, but it's used by many other international organizations and even companies that want to develop their own sustainability standards or internal documents. And as the standards become more widely used, then we can see that the user community are more demanding, and they want to see more in terms of reporting, monitoring, and key performance indicators. So one of our latest committees that deals with governance of organizations now is, at this moment, looking at standards for sustainability reporting by organizations. So you can see that the trend is growing. And again, what I can say is that from the 22,000 standards, they all cover different aspects, they all have their own measures, but we don't have a global system. So that's where I would like to leave it.
Thank you very much. That's a lot less than the time allocated, but
you told me to be brief, so
that's fine. I appreciate it. You've been kind enough to really be brief. We're going to follow a different format. So if you have any questions, I think you can ask them now. So we'll open the floor for few questions. If there are none, then we can just move on. And at the end, we will open the floor again for questions. So any questions for now? Oh. Yes, please.
Regarding 360 degree, you talk about the KPI, key performance indicator. Actually, it's a good measure for organization or whatever is performance. But it has a components. KPI is 80%. And then they have something called 360 degree, the feedback. Is it a part of ISO?
Yes, absolutely. Feedback is very important, not only in terms of the performance of the organization. In fact, if you look at the new edition of ISO 9001 as a system, as a process-based system, then it's looking at inputs, processes and outputs, and then there's a feedback loop where the feedback from the user community is critical to the survival of the company. So thank you.
Any other questions?
IMO and USA.
Yes, please.
The presentation, and just a quick question. Could you explain a little bit about I mean, it's very much linked to the previous question, but I understand you have the ISO 9 something series, 14 series, 13 series. Is there any structure within the numbers that have some meaning to it?
So a point, because that's something that when ISO started 71 years ago, they started by ISO 1 and then they follow a numerical order. And then with time, particularly since 9001 in the late 80s, early 90s, then the industry started using 9001 as a brand. So then that became quite famous, and then 14001 on environmental management also became a brand. So now most of them, there's no system other than for management systems where we tend to go for the 01 ending that industry recognizes as a management system, and the rest could be test methods, guidelines, etc. But in fairness, they should all be numbered in numerical order. But it is true that some committees like to have a little kind of grouping of numbers that they can identify as themselves, as their own. Thank you. USA?
Understanding is that one of the main objectives of the ISO is to improve, quality and, regulate products globally. Recently I find that, the cost of having these, ISO books and so on are really prohibitive in the third world. They are very, very expensive, and therefore you are defeating the main, unless if they are done, for the developed world, they are become irrelevant to the third world. And that is really sad and bad. Is there any plans, to offer these, books and information to the third world and SMEs there in particular, even for free? You are already making enough profit so far.
Well, we don't make any profit. So that's a misunderstanding. I'm glad that you asked that question because it's quite commonly perceived that ISO is making a lot of money through certification, and we don't. In fact, ISO is a federation of members, and the members may make the money, but the pricing is based on a cost recovery. So if you imagine that I mentioned that there are actually 23 ISO meetings every day of the year, and that is putting in place 100,000 experts from around the world that are contributing to that. So the cost, you may say, is prohibitively expensive, but if you look at any good management book, you pay more money than that. So there's an argument in the value of, or the cost of the standard. I accept the criticism, and I know that many people would like to see standards for free. I would like to see standards for free, and that's actually one of the key questions that the Council is looking at the moment, is one of the models. We claim, and we work closely with regulators to ensure that standards are closely linked to regulation. And in that respect, if regulation is free, standards should be free. And there are a number of standards that are actually free. If you look at our IT side, we have a joint technical committee with our sister organization, the IEC, looking at standards for telecommunication and technology, ICT. And from that collection of standards, you have over 700 freely available on our website. So you can't really say that standards are too costly, etc. But again, going back to your point, which is very valid, the cost of the standard is set in Geneva as a recommended retail price, so to speak, as any product. And then it's down to our members. If they implement the standard as a national standard, they don't pay any royalty, and they can set the price. So we don't like to talk about countries as third world countries. We prefer to say that they are developing countries, and those developing economies need support. For that, we take most of the revenue that we get ourselves from selling standards back into developing capacity in those countries. 80% of ISO members are developing countries, so we don't forget how closely related we are to them. And we have also specific groups looking at SME needs, and for that we have loads of free publication and advice. And not only that, we have programs where we work, like in the Minastar region, for developing and deployment of standards, and they come from, the cost is covered by donors and different programs that we administer, and we provide the standards for free. So I'll give you an example. ISO 26000 on social responsibility is a leading standard on not just social responsibility, but sustainability as a whole. And that standard is quite pricey because it's 100 pages of 17 principles and 47, I think, guidance points. And for that, we deployed capacity building and awareness courses around the world and provide information for free. So it's balanced. But yes, as a model, is what we have at the moment, and it's under debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last question from Colombia.
Hello, I'm afraid that he replied my question before, because well, I'm Vilma Bedoya, I come from Colombia, and work for a private company. I'm not here representing him, but as the experience I have saw there, basically in Colombia, if you don't have the ISO regulations for whatever one of the environmental or quality in foods or whatever the customer is asking, simply we cannot do business there, because it's a demand of our customers in every single industry, in foods, in textiles, yeah. And my question was if from ISO there are educational programs to share that knowledge and to teach how to implement the standard. But you replied quite well. So at the moment, by experience, I have saw the people that are working with that, it's working from the the knowledge they get from the papers, the documents, but not with a official or formal education in that matters. And I would like to know, perhaps in the delegates of the ISO in Colombia, they are working on that, or we should search that information for other sources, or perhaps in another country?
Just briefly, and muchas gracias. In fact, I'm going to Colombia on Sunday for a training session with our member body there, which is Econtech. And I know that they have a huge awareness campaign on many different standards, and they provide training and other things, and they work in partnership with universities. Again, going back to the cost of the standards, they're also available in reference libraries for free, so you can consult them. You only need to purchase the standard if you're going to get certified to it, and that's part of the requirement of the certification bodies. But if you want to know and apply the content, you can get it from my library. But again, Econtech in Colombia, they do have awareness and capacity building programs, and they work with universities and different organizations to assist people in the implementation of the standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. You give us a chance for a number of good questions. So thanks again. We move to the next presentation by Mr. Markus Schweizer. Mr. Schweizer is with Ernst Young Limited. He is a managing partner for strategic solutions. In particular, he championed public value initiatives at the company. So I look forward to your presentation, Markus. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ghassan. Really honored and delighted to be here. I will speak about why a new long-term value reporting framework is necessary and how it could look like at a high level. And I structure my short speech into three theses. My first thesis is really classic financial reporting measures, for example, IFRS and others. They really measure the wrong things. Current sustainability reporting does not bring the expected additional transparency. On the first part of this thesis, on the financial reporting, which is not really measuring the right things, we know that a P&L, a profit and loss statement, is not really reflective of shareholder returns. In fact, research shows that only 2 to maximum 10% of changes in annual shareholder returns are reflected in an annual profit and loss statement. The second aspect here is 50% of a company's value is attributable to intangible assets that are not reflected in a classic balance sheet. So in other words, the financial reporting that we have today is really not reflective of the true value of a company in shareholder terms, not speaking about the wider value a company has. A 2016 EY survey with 320 senior decision makers at institutional investors showed that only 12% of those investors are satisfied with the level of ESG, environmental, social and governance risk reporting, ESG risks that could affect the company's business model and success. That shows us that even with the progress we have seen with sustainability reporting, with standards such as ISO or triple bottom line accounting or reporting based on a global reporting initiative, apparently those developments and that progress has not been sufficient to convince institutional investors. Apparently, those standards are not comprehensive enough. José, you actually alluded to it. ISO has no comprehensive standard on sustainability reporting, or those standards are not broadly enough applied yet, or they are not sufficiently defined to bring the expected transparency. Having said that, I think those standards have good elements we need to build upon, but we need more than that. My second thesis is The strongest push for improved reporting, including on purpose, long-term strategy, and aspects of ESG practices, is now coming from the institutional investor community. Let me cite here the famous letter of Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock, as you know, hedge fund managing $4.6 trillion of assets. And in his famous letter this year, on 12th of February, he said, among other things, to prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. Companies must be able to describe their strategy for long-term growth. They must also understand the societal impact of the business, as well as the ways that broad structural trends, from slow growth to rising automation to climate change, affect potential for growth. Apparently, we see a new thinking here from the investor community. Handling ESG issues well is often a sign of operational excellence, and thus a leading indicator for long-term success and value creation. Investors want insights and not hindsight. Governments, regulators, and standard setters are also driving increased dialogue and scrutiny around sustainability reporting, but my belief is the strongest push will come from the institutional investor community here. My third thesis: an enhanced reporting for companies needs to be more relevant, simple to use, and considering a long-term holistic perspective of value creation of a company. Let me introduce here the EY long-term value reporting model. EY has started an initiative together with the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism, driven on our side by our global CEO, Mark Weinberger, together with Lady Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, who is the founder and CEO of the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism. Our proposed blueprint for a new long-term value reporting model addresses several aspects that are not addressed by the classic financial, but also by the classic sustainability reporting models. On the edge here of the model, you see the business context, the purpose, and strategy and governance. In our opinion, it's extremely important to address the context of the company to make the reporting itself more relevant. So talking about macroeconomic, social, and technological trends, for example, and address purpose, the specific purpose the company has, and the specific strategy the company has. Then the second aspect, which is distinctive here from other models, we look at value creation from an internal and an external perspective. Internal perspective can be derived into the classic 6 capitals of integrated reporting, which are established, being financial, human, social, natural, manufactured, and intellectual resources. So this is established, and we can leverage that established framework. But on the external side, and that's really one of the new elements. Here we are looking at value perceived by all relevant stakeholders, such as investors, employees, customers, regulators, and most importantly, the society as a whole. The relevance of this framework, we believe, is given through its holistic approach and bespoke business context. And we also believe it is somewhat simpler in its application, given its intuitive comprehensibility. But of course, there's a couple of practical questions now with the implementation of such a blueprint. And one practical question, one key question is, how do we measure perceived value? How do we measure this external value here? We have an answer to that question. We use a concept called public value, This morning you have heard from Helen Medina from Nestle about the concept for shared value. Now, public value is somewhat building on similar principles, but it is more holistic because it takes into consideration all possible stakeholders. The concept was first described by Professor Moore in 1995 and extended by Professor Meinhardt and Gomez from University of St. Gallen in 2009. The concept is rooted in psychological needs theory with 4 dimensions. 4 dimensions from the psychological needs theory as number 1, instrumental utilitarian perspective, where you ask the question, is it useful? Is a company, is an organization useful? Is a project or is something, a product, useful? The second dimension is a moral ethical one. Is it ethical? Third is political social. Is it politically acceptable? And the fourth dimension is hedonistic aesthetic. And the question here is, does it allow for positive experiences? Now we have added, beyond this psychological need theory, a 5th dimension for a practical application also in economy. We have added an economic perspective and asked the question, is it profitable? Now there is broad practical evidence that this model, this scorecard, as we call it, can be applied practically. There is a so-called public value atlas for Switzerland that has been established in 2015 and again in 2017. Where a selection of the most widely known organizations, both for-profit and not-for-profit, have been assessed through public surveys around those dimensions, and that has been basically drilled down to individual scores on this public value scorecard. So that makes companies also comparable in view of the value creation to society as a whole that is perceived. So that thereby answering the problem that I mentioned before, how can you actually measure this perceived value? What are our next steps together with the embankment project? On long-term value reporting, including measurement of external value perceived. In 2018, now this year, there will be a series of sprints of different work groups that cover topics around corporate governance, data management, innovation, also linking this framework to the SDGs. That is one work group that actually is actually working on this. We are working together with companies such as Dow DuPont, Unilever, BASF, Schroders or JP Morgan that are supportive of this initiative with the goal to turn this high-level blueprint into an implementable framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, on time, actually a little early, so that's good. We have time for a couple of questions. Okay, we'll move then to the third presenter. We are going to change order slightly, so the fourth presenter will actually go third, and there is Dr. Saner-Yiu has an engagement not too far from here, so she needs to present a little early, and I thank Dr. Sander Chan for allowing that. So we will move to the presentation by Professor Lichia. Saner-Yiu, if I may. Okay. All yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Abu. Well, excuse me for my very low voice, and because I've been suffering from a cold for a long time. But let me just sort of preface my presentation by saying thank you, Dimitri, for inviting me. And the second, I would like to say a few words about the background, the context of my presentation, because you'll find that, I'm trying to sort of dive deeper into this whole question about measuring. Center for Socio-economic Development is a Geneva-based think tank. We have been here for 25 years as the third ring of the UN's family here in Geneva, and have been involved in the deliberation and reflection of SDGs since 2013, mostly through the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs. But at the same time, we are accredited to the ECOSOC. So this is really how we engage with the SDGs and this whole debate about what to measure, why do we want to measure, and how to measure. But also, I want to highlight one other point, which also gives you a context and explain the flavor of my presentation, is because we have been working on SDG 17.5 and 16.5 and 16.6 about institution building for the last 30 years. And some projects we have done of note is one is to support China's reorientation from a centrally planned and economy to a more free market oriented economy. And we have been doing quite a major job there for 10 years since the mid-80s. And also we have done similar work for Russia and also for countries like Slovenia. So we have some idea in terms of the complexity of transformation. So let me just share with you in terms of how we see and understand the measurement question. So my title of that is really about monitoring process and improving coherence and coordination. The 2030 agenda we have been listening for the last 2 days, it is about business unusual, and we have heard a lot of innovation taking place at different places. But this transformative agenda is really difficult is because it involves a lot of untraditional actors, such as SMEs, informal sectors, small civil society organizations, and let me go further to say consumers and all the citizens, everyone. And the second thing is that how do we make sure that we can, for all actors who take agency in making sure that SDG can become reality, is that how do we sing from the same sheet? What is this same sheet? Which page and whose page? And the last one, we also know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned us that the moment to reach the bifurcation point of 2 degrees of global climate warming will be 17 years away. And so that will be 2 years after 2030. And in that sense, we all feel a sense of urgency because we know that for the small island states, they probably suffer many more and much more than the larger developed country like US or Europe, or in that case, Switzerland, a small country, but it's affluent. So, when we talk about acceleration, we would like to raise the questions. It's by whom and by what drivers and for whom. And I think, this is when we reflect on what kind of instrument that we need to have to build on monitoring, need to address. And so we're saying that we understand that the SDGs is a simultaneous triple bottom line approach. Nevertheless, it is easily said and is very difficult to achieve. There are a few challenges, in addition to the question I already raised, is that we have not many known solutions or formulas, so that issues of experimentation is very much upfront. And so you see in Geneva alone, we have been setting a lot of labs, hubs, impact hubs or SDG hubs or ecosystems, all with the attempt trying to experiment. But when it is experimentation in real life, the danger is that there will be real costs and secondary and tertiary collateral damage. But in a laboratory sense, it is just not complex enough. So we are caught in between of looking for solutions, but at the same time, we have to learn how to raise the right questions. And therefore, we are not only trying to address the question of how to become business ready, but at the same time, we really do not know what does that all mean in a sense. And the last one, I think it's challenging. We have seen so many successful interventions and projects, but after a few years, it petered out. So now the question is, how can we ensure that to instill the self-regulatory capabilities of institutions, so that they can continue to improve and innovate? And I think if we be fair, and which I would like to be, is that we do see in Geneva and around the world, they have started to have nexus approach, meaning combine a few sectors together and try to see how we can implement and impact simultaneously. But this kind of cross-sector interlinkages, it's difficult by itself because we do not necessarily speak the same language. A social scientist would not be able to speak with an economist or engineer in a very comprehensive manner because we use different codes. So methodologies are also very different. We don't even see the world the same way. So how do we overcome this interdisciplinary barriers is one of the, from a cognitive theoretical development point of view, is a major challenge. And the second thing, I think, learning by doing, it's fine enough. Chinese will say, you touch the stone, cross the river. And we have seen, there is success and there's failure, but as a whole, it is okay. But the question is, who suffers when there's failure? But doing by learning is also not safe. So how do we take care of, mitigate the risks? And the third point I would like to say is that we don't really have sufficient data for systemic reflection, which we have been talking in this hall for the last 2 days. And what we would like to do is move beyond what, because the agenda tells us what we should do, but it does not tell us how we should do it and why we should do what we do. And therefore, we need to move on to a much higher plan in terms of institutional learning. And this is just to satisfy myself because, Algerius is to sort of talk about triple loop learning, and this is very hard. Underlining all this is the data. And the data, if we look at the work of the UN, it is set in the sort of Assembly's resolution. Let me read it off. It is clearly recognized a robust follow-up and review mechanism for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development requires a solid framework of indicators and statistical data to monitor progress, inform policy, and ensure accountability of all stakeholders. And the Global Indicator Framework was adopted by the General Assembly on the 6th of July 2017 and is contained in the resolution adopted by the General Assembly on work of Statistics Commission pertaining to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Good news. But nevertheless, according to the Interagency Expert Group on Sustainable Development Goals, I think what we have so far is that we have 17 goals, we have 169 targets, and we have 230 indicators. However, the indicators are not of the same quality, nor cover the 17 goals and related targets in a sort of equitable manner. So instead, we have 3 batches of indicators, 93 Tier 1 indicators, 66 Tier 2 indicators, and 68 Tier 3 indicators. And there are 5 indicators that are so complex, it covers Tier 1, 2, 3, all at the same time. So what does all this tier mean? What it means is that the Tier 1, we more or less routinely collect data. More than 50% of the 192 countries regularly supply that data to the UN. And there is known theory. Conceptually, it's clear. Standards are there. Methods are there. But when you go to Tier 2, it's already problematic. And Tier 3 is really where the crux of the matter. And I will say that Tier 3 probably covers most of where 2 things meet, where poverty meets hunger, meets health, meets climate, meets jobs, meets the city. So what we are missing is really where the interlinkages that need to happen in order to have really substantial impact. And we do really, at the moment, from the UN perspective, with the height of the global arena, we do not have the methodology nor the standards. And I think this is really putting us in trouble. What does the business community trying to do? Listen to my colleague here, has a very nice reporting, and I wanted to have a copy of your presentation because I think that was very, very neat. But nevertheless, it remains in a silo. One company reports on what they're doing. It is not sufficient to have a collective impact that would somehow shift the qualitative aspect of sustainability of a place, of a territory. And we need to start thinking not only out of the silo, the sector, but we also have to start to think spatially. How, what does that mean? So in other words, when we think about implementing of sustainable development and measuring the progress, we really need to take a space, a territory, as the basic unit to do that. And we know that between different sectors, the trade talks about trade, and health talks about health, and agriculture talks about agriculture. We have done 35 years of work within the WTO. We know how difficult it is to have trade policy coherence where we know trade drives development. And if you look at what we have currently, just take number 2, the goal number 2, and hunger as example. And I just quote directly from the UN Statistics Committee and sort of put it out here. 2.3, it's look at double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. And then you have 2 indicators, and if we sort of look at it and then we say, is that sufficient? Does that implicate other sectors that has to deal with the supply and inputs for agriculture sector, the constraint of the small-scale farmers are facing? So we're saying it's not sufficient. And another one is target 2.4, which is about ensuring sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agriculture practices. Again, we have 1 indicators, and it's about proportion of agriculture area under productive and sustainable agriculture. And these are 2 examples to show it is really not sufficiently addressing the coordination and integration issue. SDG itself, the totality, is an integrated network, but we are not thinking in those terms sufficiently, and we still need to develop tools and mechanisms to do that. In 2 minutes, I'm almost done. Integrated goals and targets, I would highly recommend the work of David de Leblanc, and he works for the UN DESA, and he has a fundamental, really sort of foundational paper to look at. So let me sort of very quickly start to jump, because what I would like to appeal and advocate here is to say, let's start thinking differently. We need to have a universal framework on monitoring and citizen participation, because we want to go beyond the top-down and expert-driven approach to data generation, data collection, and data use. Because these 3 principles of SDGs, it says participation, transparency, and inclusiveness. It calls on all citizens to act in such a way it supports and enables sustainability in a particular context. So the methods, so that, we see the implementation requires horizontal and vertical integration. And so what we are proposing is to say, in addition to the work of the UN Statistics Commission and also the interagency groups, experts, and also the newly founded Partnership for SDG Data, what we need to do is to find ways to involve and engage and support people to be part of the process. So that citizen science could be one option to consider for the community and for the cities, and even Wikipedia type of mechanism might be useful. So let me just to conclude to say that accountability for 2030 is needed but it needs support of needed data. I think this is not what, and I think monitoring needs to be both results-oriented and process-oriented, and because only when we have process transparency, we can start talking about institutional learning and innovation. So with that note, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one brief question. Any burning question? Yes, please.
Well, actually, I listened to your presentation with great interest, but it is really concerning because to me, you are highlighting structural shortfalls in the whole process which is driving the 2030 agenda. So are you suggesting that we should put a break until we put the infrastructure to monitor this down, or is there any chance for success at all with what we are doing?
Well, great question. I would like to go back to what happened to MDGs. I remember when we first started, we're not sure that we're going to have, poverty, health, and for immunization, everything by half or increase by 50%. But by having the objectives clearly spelled out and have people, the countries with their leaders to sort of put down their commitment, we more or less achieved quite a bit. However, I think the second round, it's much more sophisticated in the sense that we need to do more. And therefore, what I'm saying is not we can't do it, but we're saying we have to start to be serious about following maybe in some ways what the ISO has done for many business in developing countries. And I remember there was a study looking at how ISO contributed to the companies in remote and backward places, and they can become an international player. What we need to see is a similar approach, saying that we're going to create a common platform. Data will come into the same cloud, for example, and so that citizens and citizen groups can take the liberty to look at this data and to start to inform themselves what kind of innovation or engagement they would like to do. This is top-down and bottom-up approach has to marry to each other. It is not sufficient to wait for the top to come down and say this is going well and this is not going well. If I may just take another minute, if we look at the sort of the voluntary national review, the report, there is lack of uniform reporting requirements, and therefore you cannot really make comparison. Forget about talking about learning from the best practices because we do not know sufficiently the context and why decisions are taken and why implementation is organized the way it is organized. What I'm appealing to is that we need to have a monitoring process that allows us to peek behind the closed door and to understand why decisions are taken, who are taking these decisions, and what are the constraints and the concern, and also the implementation, the innovations that are made. And that's what I'm saying. And I think it is urgent, but we shouldn't stop the work because the world doesn't wait for us until we make up our mind.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are going to move now to the last presentation by Dr. Sander Chan. Dr. Chan is with the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at the German Development Institute.
Sorry, is it working? Okay. In connection to the previous speaker, Professor Lichia, I think I can actually try to answer how effective partnerships for sustainable development are. And I will try that in an action-packed, very short presentation. Ever since 1997, when Kofi Annan became UN Secretary General, partnerships in the UN have been heavily promoted as a means to deliver deliver public goals. In 2002, at the Johannesburg World Summit for Sustainable Development, for the very first time, partnerships were presented to the whole world as an official international outcome next to more traditional political declarations. And of course, since 2016, we have partnerships for SDGs, and there is even a dedicated SDG on partnerships. The potential of these partnerships seems great. Multiple actors can pool resources, share risks, make more inclusive decisions, and thus deliver more effectively and efficiently, theoretically. Partnerships seem to be the perfect instrument in an increasingly networked and globalized world. Now, as a result, partnerships have gained international support and become globalized. On this map, from a research of mine on climate partnerships, we see that climate partnerships registered with the UNFCCC are implementing everywhere, from the US to Sub-Saharan Africa to China to even North Korea. By increasingly recognizing the role of partnerships in the UN system, there's an implied understanding that partnerships are universally applicable across every nation. However, partnerships are very context specific and refer to quite different things. For instance, what the UN recognizes as partnerships may not actually be organized as partnerships at the local level, as is illustrated on the left in this illustration. This is often the case, for instance, in China, whereas in India we see more what is represented, on the left, and on the right is China. Where we see that global partnerships are also organized as partnerships locally. The near universal presence of partnerships and the growing international recognition of their potential raises a number of questions. For instance, in spite of the UN discourse, businesses remain underrepresented, both among UN-registered partnerships for sustainable development and climate partnerships. Moreover, there's considerable underrepresentation of actors based in the global south. In this graph, you see all studies that contain data on leadership and of partnerships, and they all conclude that most leaders of public-private partnerships are in the global north. This is very problematic, as sustainability partnerships may not be delivering benefits where they are most needed. Now, let me focus on effectiveness. We know very little about effectiveness of the larger universe of partnerships. One reason is that assessment of effectiveness is fraught with difficulties. For instance, how do we assess partnerships in terms of what they do additionally to what governments do? Even when we identify successful partnerships, they may be a strategy to distract from governmental inaction. Effectiveness of individual partnerships is also problematic. Partnerships may achieve their goals, but their goals are they compatible to international targets, or do they present business as usual practices as green and social and clean and everything, the famous greenwash? There are different measures for effectiveness. Do we look at environmental or social indicators, the feasibility scale, or intended effects? I think we do more and more of the last, but a pure focus on scale and effects may also come at the cost of innovativeness. I will now focus on the method I developed together with colleagues in the Netherlands and Sweden to measure in a comparative manner the effectiveness of partnerships. Difficulty of measuring partnerships are manifold. First of all, data is collected mostly at the national level and impossible to disaggregate to individual partnerships. Moreover, because of the voluntary nature of partnerships, we cannot take compliance as the measure of effectiveness. The most important complication, however, is that the variety of partnerships complicates all kinds of research. Basically, we need to compare apples and oranges. Given these many complications, how do we assess performance of partnerships in a comparative manner? there are good case studies of individual partnerships. However, they don't add up. We still have very little indication, for instance, where the overall contribution, what the overall contribution is of the universe of partnerships to implement Agenda 2030. There are a few studies that look at multiple partnerships, but most studies do not look at actual performance. They look at self-reported data to assess whether partnerships set specific goals, whether they include measures, whether they set achievable targets, whether they are resource-based and time-bound. This SMART method may be useful, but ultimately will say little about what is actually produced. Assessment of partnerships should not only be on goal definitions and self-descriptions, but look at actual activities and production of partnerships. Therefore, I suggest the following. The first best measurement involves the tracking of actual improvements in environmental and social indicators. This requires rigid accountability frameworks and accurate data, both of which are very problematic. Next best may be to monitor behavior on an ongoing basis, which is also very difficult. Until we track real-time performance, the second best option is to look at derivative and predictive performance. However, to make meaningful estimations of what the universe of partnerships is bringing us, we have to make sure that our measurement is comparable across different partnerships. Given the great variety of partnerships, we also need to allow for various baselines. Moreover, to assess actual instead of self-reported performance, we need ex-post performance data. Taking these principles into consideration, we have developed the function output fit methodology. This three-step methodology measures output performance. First, every partnership will identify, for every partnership we identify main functions it wants to perform using inductive clustering. We have identified 12 such functions, including norm setting, campaigning, technical implementation and on-the-ground implementation. Second, for every function, we logically deduce expected outputs. For instance, a partnership that wants to campaign, we expect it to organize popular events, advertise publications, and engage in social media outreach. Finally, using data from document analysis, surveys, occasional correspondence and interviews, we compare logically deducted outputs with data and actual outputs. Based on this, we evaluate whether the production of partnerships match their function. Individual partnerships, for instance, could have a very low output performance, namely that they don't produce any relevant output. They could have a very high output performance, which means that they produce fitting outputs for every function and may have environmental and social effects. Now, using these methodologies, we assessed all 330 plus UN-registered partnerships for sustainable development between 2002 and 2010, as well as 100 UNFCCC registered climate partnerships. Partnerships for sustainable development, as you can see on the first line here, show a rather low output performance. Even after 6 years, more than 40% of these partnerships simply do not produce the outputs necessary to fulfill their function. This doesn't mean that 60% is effective. It means that we are sure that 40% does not much more than exist on paper. More positively, and maybe we can see some learning across the UN system over the years, we see that more recent climate partnerships show a much higher level of performance, which they achieve after only 1 year compared to 6 years you see with partnerships for sustainable development. So how can we use these assessments? First of all, by analyzing huge sets of partnerships for sustainable development. At the moment, there's 3,800. We could finally give an indication where all these partnerships are taking us. Second, we can isolate data for specific subsets. For instance, we could sort data by themes, SDGs, geographic regions, type of actors, etc. This could help UN organizations to attune existing policies, platforms, and promote partnerships. For instance, For instance, among climate partnerships, we see a clear difference in performance between those active in energy, agriculture, adaptation and resilience sectors. This data could help inform new policy priorities. We can also understand how partnerships are scaling over the years. This is particularly important in the global south. We need to make sure that partnerships have positive and discernible impact there where they are most necessary. To conclude, the number, context dependency, and the variety of partnerships greatly complicate assessment of partnerships. However, proper assessment is absolutely necessary. Without effective partnerships, we can forget about achieving Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. Yet, we lack the knowledge on how to assess the larger universe of partnerships. I presented with a minimal, cost-efficient and widely applicable method to measure actual output performance over very large sets of partnerships. This is, of course, not the last word on effectiveness. We need many more additional methodologies. However, our output performance assessment would at the very least indicate where the large number and the growing number of partnerships for SDGs, partnerships for climate action is taking us. There's actually much more to say, and I'm happy to discuss further with you, but I'll stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Again, on time. Appreciate it. We have time for questions.
Thank you very much indeed for all the presentation. What we have understand here is developing methodology and conceptual framework. And actually you have to share this with academia around the globe. You develop the framework, okay? And you develop your policies and the process. The people who develop the methodologies and the frameworks, the people who are specialized in this area. We as academics, if we involve in terms of research project with the UN or whatever the institution, then we can help in developing the methodologies across discipline. I think this is a lacking, and this is one key point for achieving the goals of the sustainable development. So more involvement for people who are intellectual and are able to develop the methodologies, the process, the framework around the globe. This can be achieved through providing funding. Give us the fund, then we will help you to develop the methodologies and the framework.
Thank you. Would you like specific answers from any of the panelists, or point is well taken? But
I think the one who is in UN, the first doctor, what her name, the third speaker, because she's in position to verify the fund actually.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to say that is new, mechanism. If I can look at the so-called major groups of the UN, and the first one is already science and technology, and also under the stewardship of UNESCO. I think that is a very important indication of the needing for the science community to be much more actively engaged with the policy-making bodies. So your point is well taken.
Where is the fund?
Yeah, also, I think that is really the major issue. As you know, that UN is suffering from a major cutback in terms of funding. So even civil servants here are taking a 7% cut.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, all the way in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Sukai from Jackson. I'm an inspector from the Joint Inspection Unit. I really enjoyed this session, and particularly the last two sessions. I think what those two sessions actually indicate, for me, is the actual disconnect in the types of paradigms that exist, the philosophical foundations of the SDGs, as opposed to the paradigms we've used in measurement, in analysis. I think both of those actually highlight a need for us to revisit what those paradigms are. As mentioned, the SDGs are about harmony, integration, collective action. It's about constructing reality actually as we move along. So it does depart from quite a different philosophical foundation of reality, than what used to exist in the exacting structures that we used to dealing with. The measurement principles that we have, and I am a measurement specialist, actually depart from a very different philosophical foundations. So we're sort of fitting, I don't know what that expression is, like round balls, and I think that's a total disconnect that I think came out in both presentations, and an interest actually, as mentioned by Dr. Sanders' presentation, or Lichia's presentation, on actually seeking to figure out what should be the appropriate methods. And only when we do that would be anything we measure be actually valid in the technical sense of that word. We're no longer dealing with reliability, because it would be quite naive to do that, given that we have no good best practices, and we need to actually reconstruct a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the... I'll stop there, but thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to agree with that, I come from a slightly different place. I'm an institutionalist, so I apply institutional effectiveness, and I think it needs to be applied more widely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't really have a question. The Kaderji flood from Algeria. Just observations, Sandy. I quite valued the point Lichia made on departing from the silo approach, because this is one of the big major risks that we'll be assessing each goal separately. So I think the point you raised is, to my understanding, is key issue, and it has to be addressed, I think, in a very systematic way. And how you coordinate this. And perhaps that brings me to the question to Jane, which is partnership for furthering what kind of goals? I thought you could even go further. This is a very, very good job you've done, but we could even go further to do which are and what goals have been advancing as a result of partnership.
Yeah, so like I also showed in the presentation, we have an enormous data set, and we are able to isolate like per goal or per function, and we are trying to map also the linkages between within partnerships between different goals. So this is an ongoing process. We do it in such a way that we can see progress year on year, and we can relatively quickly with the collected data show progress in different fields. But of course, we still need to understand what the nature is of these linkages.
One last question. Okay, well, I have 3 more things to do, and that will take us about 20 more minutes. So I'm just kidding. I would like to thank our speakers very much. I think on a short notice, they were asked to sort of cut their presentation, and all did very well. I thank you very much. Can't thank you enough, actually, that you did it on the spot. And I would like to thank the audience. Thank you for staying behind. Also, I would like to take a minute and thank our hosts, Dr. Demetrio and Dr. Ahmed. This is a wonderful opportunity to bring this diversity together in one room and sort of talk and listen and learn from each other. I did learn quite a bit. So thank you all. I think the session is formally over. Thank you.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.